Hi, good evening, everyone. For those attending in person, if you could please come and take your seats, we'd like to get started. Don't be shy, come up to the front. If everyone could please take their seats, the panel's ready to come in once everyone is seated. Hi, come up to the front. If everyone could be seated, please. We'd like to get started. You know the drill. Up here, there's seats up front. Don't be shy, plenty of seats up front. If you can move up to the front, please. There are plenty of seats. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this session of the Young Professionals Briefing Series. We have guests joining here in person in New York as well as on Zoom, so welcome one and all. I'm Stacy LaFollette. I'm Managing Director of the Meetings Program here at the Council on Foreign Relations. And as some of you know, because if you've attended these sessions before, the Council works to offer you all one session a month at least. And ideally, we alternate between New York and Washington, and we offer via Zoom. So we hope you've attended some of these and that you will continue to attend them. One new development is that we've expanded the invite list to include staff members of the Council who are young professionals. So we welcome staff of the Council who are here this evening, as well as CFR's term members. So we welcome any term members who are here this evening. Now, if you want more information about the Young Professional Series and the term member program, you can look at the roster that was handed out this evening. And we have a little description on the second page of what each of these series and programs are with a link. So we encourage you to go on CFR.org and get more information about young professionals and the term member program. A reminder that this meeting is on the record. And for those in New York, we encourage you to check your electronic devices, cell phones, and please silence them so we don't have any interruptions to tonight's discussion. If you want to ask questions and you're in person, please, during the Q&A, raise your hand. If you're called on by our presider, please stand, wait for one of these microphones, and then introduce yourself and ask your question. If you're joining us via Zoom, click on the raise hand icon on the Zoom window at any time. During the Q&A, if you hear your name being called out, please click on the unmute now prompt and then proceed with introducing yourself and asking your question. We encourage you to please think about your questions now and raise your hand or click on the raise hand icon. And we hope you have plenty of questions. And also, after the discussion, there's a networking reception for those in person. So we hope you will all stay and mingle with young professionals, staff, and term members. Thank you.
So bushy. We're all facing a future with AI, but I cannot face a future without dogs. So, hi everybody. Thanks for being here tonight. I really appreciate you. It's so exciting to see you. I'm Kat Duffy. I'm the Senior Fellow here at the Council for Digital and Cyberspace Policy, or as Kyle and I like to say, the Techie Techs. And so I'm really delighted to welcome you all here today to two friends and colleagues of mine, Joni Kletter and Zhao Chen. And what we're really going to talk about today is sort of the way that we're thinking about digital transformation in this moment. So we're going to be telling you a little bit of a story of some digital transformation that was taking place in New York over COVID that Joni was leading, and now how we're thinking about digital transformation in cities, especially as we think about AI and its role, and what it's going to take to get there. Because, like, spoiler alert, it's not just about the data models. right? There's a lot to think about when you think about how you actually operationalize and realize a digital transformation in a city and space as complex as New York in particular. And so with that, I'm going to start by asking both Joni and Jahao to just introduce themselves, explain a little bit of their background, and maybe a little bit about why they're excited to talk to like very fancy younger people today. So Joni, you want to start with you?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for having me. This is really wonderful. Thank you, Kat. I've known Kat since college. We went to college together. And
We were your age together, and it was, thank God it was before social media.
Yes, oh my God, thank God. And then I went to law school and became a lawyer. I was a federal law clerk for 2 years in the Eastern District of New York and was a labor and employment lawyer for about 8 years. But I lived in Park Slope and became friendly with Bill de Blasio when he was running for public advocate. I really liked what he stood for and his policy positions, and I did a little bit of volunteering for him then, but I stayed in private practice. And then I volunteered for his mayoral campaign, and when he won, I joined the administration. I started off in the city legislative affairs office, so I was working very closely with the city council and the agencies, negotiating city council legislation and the budget, and just kind of in the middle of everything at City Hall. And then I became his director of appointments, and then I became the commissioner of the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. That was through 2022, and now I do some consulting, and I'm back in private practice as a litigator. So thank you.
Fantastic. Jahao, over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Jahao. This is Tank over here. So I'm currently serving as the Director of AI and Machine Learning at New York City's Office of Technology and Innovation. However, I'm here in my personal capacity, and my views do not necessarily constitute the views of the city or the agency. So having said that, I have been in this role for 2 months. Formerly worked at a startup, and before that worked in machine learning at 2 banks you may have heard of. So I was one of the founding members of the AI research department at JP Morgan. Before that, I was a data scientist at Capital One. And before that, I was an academic at MIT. So my background is not in law, not in policy. So I'm not really sure why I'm here, but yeah, so I graduated in 2009. Not a good time to look for industry jobs. Stayed in academia. And then 2016, and the deep learning revolution hit, and I was really struck by how there's all this innovation going on in tech companies. And I was really interested to see how industry and broader society is like adopting all these things that used to be solely the domain of like obscure academics, computer science departments. And so I left, ended up working in banking, got really interested in this space of regulated model decision making. So banks, of course, famously very heavily regulated. Any machine learning models that are being built have to be analyzed for bias. They have to be shown for like compliance with the anti-discrimination laws. Consumers have the right to explanation. So how do we engineer that into models? I was really interested in that. And of course, famous last words, right? And I was like, oh, how hard could this be? This is an interesting problem. And I'm still working on some variant of this problem. What brought me, the reason why I applied for this job was because, as you know, like AI has really exploded. I like to remind people that we are only 16 months into the launch of ChatGPT, even though it feels for some people that it's been around forever. And just like the speed at which that became just so ubiquitous and normalized for us, I think is butting up heads against like the traditional like more languid processes of government and policymaking. And I was starting to feel concerned that we're in this situation where policymakers feel like they need to do something, but they don't know necessarily what it is, because not only is that domain expertise hard to get, but it's also just very, very quickly evolving. And so when this opportunity came up, I was like, well, I've been working in this area of like AI risk management and ethics for a while, and this is an opportunity to put my money where my mouth is. And so this is how I ended up here.
That's awesome. And I want to ask you all, how many of you would say right now that you work in something involving AI, like that your jobs are AI-ish? Okay. How many of you are working something that's like hard focused on AI? Okay. So, and then how many of you are like, AI is not part of my daily job? Like okay, this is a really good mix. How many, for those of you especially who sort of aren't working in or with AI routinely, how many of you feel like good, interested, excited about like what it might offer? And how many of you are like, oh shit? Yep. Okay. That's a healthy mix. Thank you for your honesty. Yeah. So I think for me, one of the, what you're already hearing is you're going to hear right now about two very different types of expertise and the way that they're getting brought into a place as complex as New York City, and how those how that expertise is playing in a really unique moment in time as well, right? Like with AI, I mean, AI is not new. It's been around a real long time. And this amount of focus and attention to it is, I think, astonishing for most people who've been working in it for a long time. It's really like whoa, like what happened? And so, Joni, I want to start with you a little bit. Can you walk us through what you were doing and what life was in, say, like December, November of 2019?
Yeah.
And how it was feeling in like April of 2020.
Which I think we all have our stories
We
that we
all have
can
our
tell about the
stories.
two different worlds that we were living in. But yeah, well, first, I just want to say that I'm so glad that you're focused on New York City. And I assume most of you live in New York City and you use New York City services and you probably interact somewhat with New York City government. And I think it's really great that we're talking about a municipality, even though we're at the Council on Foreign Relations, because New York City, it's an international city. It's also a municipality with 9 million people, and with the larger metropolitan area impacts over 20 million people. And the work that's happening in the city and the things that are being done have repercussions and an impact on cities and places around the world. I'm just thinking about like our IDNYC program, for example, where we offered IDs for immigrants who didn't have passports or licenses, and the impact that had on the rest of the world. So the things that happen in New York City have major repercussions throughout the world. And there are, just to kind of touch on the level, how massive a bureaucracy New York City is. There are over 300,000 people that work for New York City. There's a budget that's over $100 billion. And there's over 1 million school children who attend New York City public schools, which is, larger than most cities in the country, right? And so it's a massive, massive bureaucracy. There's over 50 city agencies. There's over 150,000 people that work, for example, at the Department of Education. There's over 60,000 people that work at the NYPD, the police department. And so to get these agencies to innovate and to work on kind of new ideas and try new things can be very challenging. And if you think about it, right, like imagine a mayor who comes into city government and they're running on all of these policy ideas, things they want to do differently, changes they want to make. Mayor de Blasio ran on universal pre-K. Then at some point he talked about closing Rikers Island. These are major, obviously, programs that have to be implemented, and you need a lot of people to do it. And so then you come in, you win, and you come in and you're mayor, right? And you bring with you maybe 150 to 200 people with you, right? So you're staffing City Hall and you're appointing commissioners to run these agencies. But you still have 300,000 people that are mostly public servants who have been in those roles for 20 to 30 years, maybe. A lot of them have been there over at least 15 years, most city employees. And you come to them as the commissioner of the agency and you say, all right, we're ready, we're gonna do these different things. And they're looking at you like, what are you talking about? Like, I've been here for 20 years doing the exact same thing. Like, and now you're telling me I have to do something different? No, sorry, my collective bargaining agreement doesn't say that. I'm a union member. You can't make me do anything, right? Go fly a kite. And it's a real challenge. And I think for so many bureaucracies, New York City is probably the best example, but you see this in bureaucracies in private companies, other municipalities.
Definitely in the federal government as well.
Yeah, federal government, most government agencies, but also any large company has this challenge. And for me, when I became commissioner at the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings, it was March 2020. It was literally the week before COVID hit. And fortunately, I had spent time at City Hall and developed relationships with basically every agency in city government. Because I was working on legislation, working on policy, and working with the city council, I was able to build relationships with most agencies. I knew the commissioners. I knew a lot of the policy folks. And so that when COVID hit and everything shut down, my agency, which conducts 500 in-person hearings a day, and I'll explain a little bit about what we do at Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. We adjudicate the tickets that are issued and the summonses that are issued by the city agencies. That's one thing we do. We have a couple other things we do, but the main thing we do is to offer an independent hearing officer to adjudicate the tickets that are issued by the agencies. For example, when the Department of Buildings issues, an illegal conversion ticket, or sanitation issues a ticket, and there's about 800,000 tickets issued a year by the various city agencies. Yeah, it's a lot. Department of Health, Department of Consumer Affairs and Protection. And so when the city shut down, all of a sudden it was like, what are we going to do? There's 500 in-person hearings that we do throughout our 5 boroughs in these offices. And I had just arrived. And fortunately, I was able to immediately contract with a company called Court Call. And fortunately, because the emergency procurement services allowed us to initiate these contracts without having to go through an RFP and a longer process, I immediately hired this company, which allowed us to set up a web platform to hold telephonic hearings and to electronically, upload documents and evidence for cases, and to hold over 500 hearings a day, which really required just a lot of ingenuity in many ways. And I think for me, coming in, having new leadership into an agency was important. And to bring that new energy, I also think having the impact of COVID, where we didn't have a choice. We had to do something different. And it was able to provide us with this platform that now will never go back to the way it was, right? So now the convenience that doing a telephonic hearing offers to people is like, A, they don't have to spend their day going into Manhattan, waiting 3 hours in an office to have an hour-long hearing with a hearing officer, and literally give up an entire day to do that. So with our platform, we'll actually call you when the hearing is ready, so you don't have to even stay on the phone on hold for an hour. The hearing officer or the platform will reach out to you when the hearing officer is ready for your hearing. We send electronic text messages to remind people that they have a hearing that day. And we've just added so many conveniences to make it easier and safer. And yeah, I mean, because like I said, we issue tickets related to health and safety, there was no way for us to just say, okay, stop issuing tickets. We can't do hearings. And so I think COVID really forced us to make this change, but it's been so beneficial to the city. And I think in many ways, these types of online platforms, obviously Zoom, and the convenience, the technology that we have now to do these types of hearings. I mean, jury duty and other types of, I'm just thinking, just government court administration that can be done.
And how many did you, by the time that you were sort of heading at, Like,
Yeah.
it's an,
So
like
there
an
was-
insane number,
Yeah, it is
right?
an insane number. Like in the first year, we did 100,000 remote hearings. And then when I left, it was like over 250,000 remote hearings were done.
And
So
before
I
that,
think it's the most, we're like the busiest court in the country. Yeah.
and before that moment, was there any capacity to do remote hearings at all?
Very few. Yeah. I think if
Right.
someone had a
A
disability.
disability or something, like it would be
Right.
like an ADA type thing.
Yeah, exactly. But we didn't have, the capability essentially to have it, because you have to have it recorded and you
Mhm.
have to have the hearing officer in place. And
Yeah.
no, and it's training and then training the hearing officer, putting the rules together to make sure, like I had to work closely with the law department to make sure we had the policies and procedures in place. The mayor had to issue an executive order that allowed us to do it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of agencies and people involved in making it work. And like I said, fortunately, I had those relationships to build upon to kind of make it happen. But yeah, there's so many people involved with that work. And
Yeah.
if you're not all on the same page, it becomes that much more difficult. So.
And what's so interesting is that you have a very non-technological problem that you are then trying to use technology to solve. And Jahal, I want to go over to you now because one of the things that strikes me a lot about our current AI discourse as well is that there's a lot of like there's a lot of throwing AI at problems that like don't necessarily need to be solved either, right? Like it's sometimes it's just people want the whiz bangery of the AI, and it's like I don't know that you need. It feels a little bit to me like the way I felt about the blockchain. It's like I feel like you just need a database, maybe SQL, and you're going to be fine. I don't really think you need blockchain. But anyway, can you take us through like what I'm hearing from Joni is it was a moment in which political will had shifted. It was a critical sort of space and moment in time in which more change was possible than previously. That you needed to have people on board who truly understood how to make the technology work to solve problems. And then you also needed to have a lot of people on board who truly understood how to make things work in the city and in the city administration and within the laws and sort of with the clients, right? And then finally, there was flexibility in things like hiring and procurement, that you didn't have to do everything, as you said, at that sort of languid pace, right? So I know that you can't speak in your official capacity, but when you think about cities like big cities like New York, right, and the complexity that New York offers, for you, what are some of the most sort of exciting opportunities that are out there? How do you think about it? And then where do you feel like people are maybe like going a little too far afield and they're thinking of what it could do or how it could transform things?
Yeah, yes. Well, so first of all, I feel like that discourse on AI as techno-solutionism, like it's both like new and old at the same time. But it's old in the sense of like, oh, the disruptive ideas of technology have been around literally since the Industrial Revolution. And
Tank really wagged his tail when you said disruptive.
okay.
Thing.
Yeah, and so in that capacity, like like any transformative technology, people are worried about like what will happen to my jobs. Your job is safe. It's okay. Yeah, people worry about what's going to happen to my job, what's going to happen to my workplace, or like how will like the structures, the social fabric like change in response to that. And of course, like I wasn't at the city during COVID. I was still at JP Morgan, but I can tell you that when we had to switch over to all virtual, like our old telephony system just crashed for 2 days. And there was an emergency procurement order to order a different platform. And then we just were like, this is so much better than the old thing that we had. And so we all switched over. It's and so like, I remember that disruption. I think one of the things that COVID really highlighted was also like this tension between public responsibility and confidentiality. So especially when we think about contact tracing, for example, right? This is one of the big things where like, the old way of doing contact tracing was very manual, and you called people and you're like, oh, you were in contact with so-and-so in the hospital for X number of minutes, we need to trace you. And then when COVID blew up, it was just not practical to do this with purely human labor. And so then people were like, oh, let's do like apps and like digital tokens, and you can see that different cities, different countries had different responses to like how that was implemented. But there was really, I think, for the first time, like this is very different from like the previous SARS virus. Like so, like like COVID is like a descendant of SARS. Like it's in the same like family, and like SARS was a big thing in East Asia. And so when I was in Singapore at that time, like SARS version 1 in 2003, like that was very different. Right? It was like quarantine, stay at home. Like people will call you all the time and be like, "Are you sure? Like you didn't leave your home? Blah blah blah." Right? And of course, people tried that for maybe the first month of COVID or two before people were like everyone is falling sick. Like we don't even have enough people to staff the call center and the hotlines, and so that particular discussion, at least in Singapore, I can tell you that contact tracing data was used to investigate some crimes. And so this is a thing where it was like, well, the government's collecting this data.
Right.
It is then being repurposed for something else. And of course, Singapore is a different country from the US. But I think you would imagine that like maybe people here would not be so thrilled about having contact tracing data being used for police activity or like law enforcement of various forms. And so that's always a tension that I think you think about in terms of like you build a technical solution and then now you collect the data and then what else could like in a corporate sense, like what other value is in this data? How can I use it for something else? And then that's where I think a lot of the risk in terms of like governance of use starts to creep in, where you go like, I built this for this purpose. Now I have the data. Now I have the system. Can I use the data for some other purpose? Can I use the system for some other purpose? And I think that's where a lot of the more problematic issues come up, where you go like, is it appropriate to repurpose the data for this use case? Is it like if I built like a thing that maybe it's like a recommendation system for like, recommending you like what, let's say it's an off-the-shelf recommendation system. It's just recommending like what music you need to play. Like, is it appropriate for me to take this recommendation system and now plug it into like 311 and say like, the recommendation system will now tell you what benefits you should apply for, right? And so like there are all these kinds of transfer type problems that I think are they form a very specific category of risk, but I think it's one that I think it's very common, and it's very, particularly when you think about the economic motivations, right? So why do we automate things? It's because we want to do more with less. And so now you have the thing, now you've scaled the thing, and now I want to use it for more things. And so I think there's a very natural evolution of like, I was motivated by scarcity, and now I have the thing and it works. Now I want to use it everywhere. But then you have to think about whether or not there's transfer issues in terms of the use case and data and all of that.
Well, and so this question, I think one of the most interesting questions right now that we're seeing with large language models is this question of, is more actually better? And Joni, to your point around just the size and diversity of New York City, right? If you think about the collective data of the 20 million people essentially in metropolitan New York area, like the amount of that would be available, when you think about like the research that could be done, if a lot of that data was, cleaned and like pulled together and people could run analytics against it, like the way that you would think about city services. But then you also have to think about like, what are the civil rights of different types of data sets, and how do you control, like, if you put it all into one model, right? Like, how are you going to think about provenance? So when you're thinking about, like, when folks, not you maybe, but like in general, where do you feel like governments, when they're thinking about citizens' data and data that has come from like public systems and taxpayer-funded systems, where do you think there should be like ethical lines getting drawn in terms of how that data is used, how it could be combined? Should it live with the city? Should it, to Joni's point, is it about having stronger regulations for contractors? Like, how do you think about some of the sort of back end elements of it right now? Again, not speaking officially for New York, but like just your take as you.
Yeah, so I'll talk about bias testing. I think this is the use case I've thought about the most. So the fundamental paradox here is that I think we want our system to be biased and unbiased, and therefore, like for things to be unbiased, you may want to argue things like my resume screener should never see race. I should scrub the names because we know that this is a source of like unconscious or maybe not so unconscious bias by recruiters, hiring managers. Therefore, we take this out of the equation. So there's like fairness through blindness is what we call it these days. But we know that that's also not enough because we still need to be able to assess like, is there actually bias in my system? And so you need those labels in order to, you need that demographic information to be able to assess whether or not your system is biased, even if you didn't want your original system to be biased. And so then this creates a very difficult data management problem because if imagine that I am a startup building like, you know, the next LinkedIn, for example, and I want my thing to be like the most powerful, like match, find your perfect candidate, like type of solution. And then suddenly like, you know, EEOC comes knocking on your door and goes like, well, have you been checking if your AI system that you're powering your shortlisting function for hiring managers, how do you know that it's not excluding all the women in my pool, right? And so if your answer is just like, well, I scrub names, so I can't see gender, like, is that believable? Like, you know, maybe you could imagine that maybe you went to Smith College, or maybe you played in the women's lacrosse team, and that's on your CV, and so that is still a marker that is in principle parsable. And this goes to like a very, again, one of these like sort of contradictory issues in AI where like the whole point of AI, like the value proposition is to discover patterns that are literally beyond human comprehension. Like if a human could understand it, I wouldn't need AI to do it, right? Then this is like automation, like just to make it run at scale. And so if you're tasking an AI system to learn patterns that are literally beyond human comprehension, how are you then expected to understand if it's being biased or if it's being transparent or being explainable? So there's a lot of talk about, oh, like we removed this from the system, so it's now like bias-free, it's now explainable, we can do this and that. But fundamentally, are you solving this problem of this thing is doing something very complicated by construction and it's learning patterns? So in the resume screener example, these are the patterns that I just described are the ones I can comprehend and I can explain to you in a finite amount of time. But you can imagine that AI could learn much, much more subtle things like, I don't know, maybe it could be down to like your choice of fonts, and maybe like, you know, it will learn things like, oh, minorities are like, you know, 2% less likely to change the default font, and therefore like that's an indicator, and that's also like predictive of a signal. Like it could be something as obscure as that humans would never pick up on, but somehow to the AI system, it's like, oh, no, correlation with the thing that I was told to optimize, and so therefore that's the answer.
Now I think there's a pretty famous example of an AI system that was trying to, it was a facial recognition system where they were trying to sort of remove gender bias, but then they discovered that the AI system had essentially learned, and it was for like Black faces, and the AI system had essentially learned that if somebody was wearing makeup, it was a woman, and if they weren't wearing makeup, it was a man. You know, it was just one of these, like they tried to scrape and pull and scrub out as much as they possibly could to avoid bias, and then the system had just learned on its own, right? That
Well, it clearly didn't train on drag shows.
But right, no,
Yes,
exactly. And so,
exactly,
like, basically, it was identifying people with like bright blue eyeshadow as women, but like a neutral eyeshadow is, you know, not right. But so again, it just sort of gone awry.
Yeah, I was just gonna to go back to your question about the city and collecting information. I know one issue that I believe is still out there is the gang database that the NYPD collects, and it's not entirely clear how someone even gets in the database, and then they're in a database that's labeled a gang database, and it's just not fully clear too what they're doing with that information and what could be done in the future, right? The unknowns. I think that's part of a concern too, is like what could be done with the information that is being collected, and where are we going with it? But I think it's still an issue. If you Google it, you'll find out, I believe, but it was a problem for a very long time. That's, I don't think, ever got addressed.
Well, and you think a lot about sort of liability, right, as well. Like, what is the responsibility to citizens? And then also, where are you open, essentially, to lawsuits from citizens for having violated their rights, right? And so how, like, when you think about the way that something like AI would roll out, or like massive sort of data sets of information in a city like New York getting rolled in, what comes to mind for you in terms of like, whoa, Nelly? I'm from Kentucky.
I mean, I think there's just so many different ways in which it could be used for targeting people. And I should have prepared more and really thought about that question, because
No,
it's such
no.
an important question. And I think there's so many good things that are happening on the city level. And I know, and I'm not in the city anymore, so I can talk about it because it's just things that I think are relatively public, which is some like data mapping where there's online accounts for people who are receiving SNAP benefits, and your eligibility for SNAP benefits is being used to connect you to other social services that you might need, right? So these are all very positive benefits. I could see at the same time, targeting people who may be receiving those types of benefits. It's like, okay, those are maybe a less, a poorer group of people, and could potentially be targeted for nefarious things that that you probably know better than I do around how that targeting could be used.
Yeah, so even just that question of like what data is appropriate for use case, like in banking and financial services, this is something that comes up all the time. And when you say something like, well, if I know where you live because like your mortgage is with me and I work at Chase, and therefore I know exactly where you are, like, can I now use this to cross-sell you like a credit card? And so this immediately comes into a question of like repurposing of data. So under current Dodd-Frank restrictions, like there are very specific things on like how you can and cannot reuse this data for marketing and cross-selling. And in particular, like when we think about like geographical data, as we know in this country, because of the very complex social and economic history of this country, where you live is very strongly predictive of your cultural background, your ethnic background. And therefore, if I'm trying to target a population, so like this is fun, again, like think about like fundamentally, the best marketing is to find exactly the right customer, which means that you want to be precise. But if you're precise about locality, then are you being precise about race and ethnicity in a way that is not permissible? And so a lot of these questions, I think, come into like the territory of unintended consequences, right? And so this is like, in some sense, like an old example, because this is like risk scoring, which is like a very, by modern standards, a very mature area of like machine learning and usage. But if you think about generative AI, like if I ask it to make a picture of a beautiful woman, because apparently when you are a 16-year-old boy, like that's what you ask Midjourney to create, and like what kind of ethnicity, what kind of art style comes out, like it's very, very stereotypical. And so if I'm now trying to think about, let's say I'm interested in Midjourney because maybe it can supplant my capacity to provide sign language, annotations of a recording, or maybe I'm gonna use it to generate some sort of graphic art to put on like a public sign. Like suddenly I'm in this territory of like, well, that seemed to work well for that use case. Like, what could possibly go wrong if I'm now creating public-facing material as really just anybody, right? Like it doesn't even have to be government. It's like, even if I'm a business, I worry about like, is there a reputational risk if I'm using this thing and it creates something that people get, it's offensive, it blows up, and then like suddenly you're like, pilloried on the social media, and then suddenly it's a PR crisis, right? So I think any large organization worries about this.
You're Google,
right?
and you launch Gemini, and in the name of inclusion, you've got racially diverse Nazis. Like, it was not a great week for them. And this is, I don't know if this still works, but you might want to try it. It was working as of a couple of months ago. I haven't tried it recently. But if you go into GPT-4 and you use the prompt, write this like a man or write this like a woman, you'll get totally different results. And try write like a man, turns out.
Really accurate then.
I was mostly like I was like OpenAI, like I write like an American because it's just like bullet points, so many bullet points. I was like, I just write like an American. We have this amazing group. I could talk to you all forever. I have like 1,000 questions, but I want to turn it over to you all and to our members or guests online as well to hear any questions from you. So yeah, go ahead.
Thank you both for making the time. Really enjoyed this being a former New York City employee in 2 agencies. I had 2 questions. One, what would you say is the most, let's say, interesting use case or unit across the agencies in New York City government today that you can talk about? And 2, having worked in the agency and also now in the private sector, I think one of the big challenges that agencies often face or institutions often face is whether to innovate in-house or to bring on an external vendor to achieve some sort of objectives. How do you guys think about the decision on whether to pursue something in-house or by bringing on a vendor?
I'm so interested in how you think about this being 2 months in the city after being at like JP Morgan.
I will say that one of the things that has struck me about working in a government agency is that governments don't. It's not normal. It's not very common for people to build technical tools in-house. It's much more common to procure. And if you look at now the research on AI governance and AI ethics, it's almost exclusively dedicated to the assumption that you are a tech company and you're building something in-house. And how do I like audit the model for bias or audit it for risk of this form? And the interesting thing here is that if you're in a procured situation, you're buying a black box, right? It's very unlikely that the vendor is going to let you poke inside. But basically, like with very few exceptions, right? Like if you're like a military provider, like they almost certainly like will strong arm you to like show you what's inside. But like if you're anyone else, they'd be like, why would I show you my secret sauce? Like this is literally like my valuable IP. This is my trade secret. Blah blah blah. But on the user end, I now have to rely on the vendor's assurances, whether it's a sales pitch, whether it's contractual liability, like these kinds of mechanisms to make sure that if I tell you that my tool performs as intended, that I'm actually trying to make a statement that it will, and to the point where like if it goes wrong, like you can sue me, you can find fault with me, right? So like it now comes down to like the very non-technical aspects of like what's your legal protection, what's your contract look like, what's your procurement structures. So there's a lot of that kind of discussion which I'm learning about. And you can imagine that New York City being a very decentralized place, this is the other thing I'm learning, is that it's like there are cities that are very centralized, so there are local governments, like there's like a central tech office, and the central tech office does everything for that organization. And then there's New York City that's literally like 350 years old, and so it's just this organic like milieu of like different tech agencies and chief information officers, and they all have their specific needs. So like Department of Health probably has very different needs from like your agency, your former agency, Oath, and like that maybe has very different needs from like Department of Education and so on. And so like all of like data handling, data regulations in these different use cases are also quite different. And so that there's like that challenge of like, do we expect like a one-size-fits-all solution, or do we have to customize it? Customization is antithetical to scale, and so this is like one of the tensions of like to be very stereotypical. It's like stereotypical tech culture versus stereotypical like legal and like government kind of thinking. Like that's I think one of the big tension points.
Well, and that's this follow up for you actually on this as well.
Court Call was the vendor that we ended up using, and I think the way that I described municipal government really kind of highlights some of the challenges you have with doing these types of things in-house, right? Because so many city employees are civil servants, right? They took a test to fill the role that they're filling, and those are the specific job duties that they have, and it's very hard to pivot and to bring, and even just to bring in like new, to say, oh, we're going to create a new unit and hire all new people. It can be very challenging, just given the the hiring restrictions and the budgets and everything else. So particularly during COVID, it really kind of gave the city an opportunity to quickly procure this new technology. I do think you brought up definitely some of the tension and challenges that you have, like I mean, what are they doing with the information? Are they keeping it secure? And are we allowed to see their code? Two is the silos that so many agencies are in because they're such massive agencies. So DOE is contracting with all these vendors, but most of the other agencies don't really know what vendors are being used. So there's a lot of duplication, and just given the size of the city, I don't know how you fix that problem, but
No comment.
yeah.
No,
Yeah,
but so I have a question on this then. So like when you think about, having moved the hearings on to Zoom, for example, right? But like now Zoom has, AI operating in the back end, can automatically generate transcripts. Like there's a lot of revenue savings for the city in having a really advanced like AI model that is backing Zoom
You might not need a
generating.
hearing well, you might not need a hearing officer.
Right.
You could have AI do the hearing,
Right.
potentially, right?
But then also Zoom has all of the information, that has been discussed during that hearing, and presumably there's significant sort of confidentiality concerns in that mix. And then for the generative models, and Jahal, tell me if I'm right or wrong on this. What's really interesting to me about the generative models is that they're learning against things like your own prompts, right? And so it's one thing if you have like the sort of initial data model, but then if you are investing all the time of like, it's the expertise and the creativity and the questions of New York City citizens and employees and officials who are working with that model that's going to make that model smarter and more responsive. And who owns that? So how do you avoid something like vendor entrapment, right? Which is something we dealt with a lot in civic technology. Where does New York get to claim essentially the IP so that it's not trapped with one particular backend vendor, right? And move it over. So these are like, if you had been thinking in that moment about like Zoom, like talking to the lawyers, what are the questions or what types of lawyers would you have wanted to have in the room? Because there's an element of this where you have to understand how it works to understand the
make a
legal
comment on Zoom?
issues.
Yeah.
So we can thank the Europeans for enabling this very obscure setting in Zoom that lets you choose which country's servers you allow your data to sit on. And so there's a specific thing you can go in at advanced settings to say, like, you can uncheck, like, I do not want to use a Zoom server located in, and there's a list. And so there are lists of countries in Europe, lists of countries in Asia, and those kinds of things.
Noting this for our meetings team.
No, so data sovereignty is like one of the big aspects of GDPR, and I think the US is not quite so. The US is just like one monolith, right? Versus like in Europe, like every state's different. Right? Like speaking to a whole room of people who know this way better than I do. So the fact that there's like processing restrictions on where that data can sit, that's actually something that starts to resemble like the issues around like government cloud. And so that there are now certain kinds of government use cases where like data cannot physically leave the US. How do you guarantee that if you're using Zoom? Well, that's why there's now an option in Zoom to choose the server, or you literally buy like what is like GovCloud, right? So like you buy the cloud solution that's specifically approved for government clients, and then you sit there. And so every now and then people get confused because like GovCloud Zoom is a different web server from Zoom.us, which is the default server, and people go like, this looks really janky. It's like called US GovCloud dot like something random. And I'm like, is this really Zoom? Actually, it is, but it's because it's on the GovCloud instance.
But so when you're thinking about like procurement, right? And what you're looking for, like when you think about the people who are experts in procurement and what's legal and what's not, and like where you could bend a rule, right, versus where you can't, those aren't generally going to be the same people who are going to be expert in, we have to think about the data security, we have to think about the servers, we have to think about cross-border transactions. So Joni, when you hear that, like, what do you?
Right. Well, when I was at Oath, it was all happening so fast.
Yeah.
That it's like, and these issues weren't even really ripe yet because I didn't know exactly, what was going to happen. Yeah, I was worried about just making sure, okay, these hearings are going to get online and we're going to do them, and make sure that everyone's getting their hearing and
Yeah. Well,
move
you
this
had two
forward.
children
So-
distance
Yeah,
learning
exactly.
at
I
home,
do
to
get-
be clear.
And so, and also given that there wasn't an RFP process, which made it so much easier. I mean, we could
Yeah.
I hired Court Call within the first week that I started at Oath, and it's not as much of an issue at Oath because the hearings are technically like public hearings. There's actually reporters who could listen in if they wanted to. You know, Eric Adams ended up having a hearing at Oath, and or one of the attorneys appeared for him. But like, if you wanted to, you could listen in onto the hearing. But it's certainly, yeah. I mean, you would need lawyers, you need IP people, and there's a whole just group that needs to analyze what's happening with this data that wasn't even considered at the time that I was.
Yeah. Others? Yes.
Hi, everyone. Jordan Sandman here. I work with CoDevelop. We're a funder of digital transformation efforts around the world in a new field called digital public infrastructure. We fund both the technical assistance, but also civil society groups that are doing digital rights advocacy. One of the questions we're really interested in is how governments are listening in this era of digital transformation. And so I'm curious if you had any examples of understanding the most at-risk groups as you did digital transformation in government, or if you've sort of engaged with civil society groups and had something that we're calling like a holding environment where you can have open discourse to understand where the risks are as you're doing digital transformation.
Great. Who, do you want to take, I mean, I immediately thought about like computational propaganda project and like what they did in Taiwan, but how do you think about it?
Yeah, so I can comment on what is public. So there is an advisory network being set up through OTI that is trying to bring in these external voices. So that's definitely something that's on our radar to make sure that we're listening to people representing the sheer diversity of what happens in New York City. And maybe I'll comment on like one specific problem that has been, that I've sort of gotten into this rabbit hole around Local Law 30 of 2017. So what is this law? This is the law that requires the city to provide services in languages other than English. And so there's annual public reporting, which yes, if you need something to do before you go to bed, like you can read the annual reporting for Local Law 30. But it really is interesting to see like how does this mandate that is citywide, that like we need to provide services in 10 languages that are not English, that are by some definition widely spoken in the city. How do you determine what those are, and what are your obligations there? And it's really interesting to read that there are various agencies that were like, okay, well, that's the legal mandate, but like when we're actually sending field agents to like, at-home nurses, or like, visiting, checking in on people, like we will be like, this vulnerable population like doesn't speak English, like, their first language is like, like Somali or something that's like, not even on the top 10 list, let alone like a well-resourced list. And then now you bring that question of diversity, of linguistic diversity, to the question of like, oh, imagine if I want to now put AI behind like some city service, like, what if AI was being used to like, do a quick screen and pre-approve you for benefits, for example. Maybe this is an initiative to like, to streamline you, but then the people applying for benefits are also the people most likely to now require services in a language that's not English. And by law, like, you're supposed to provide these. And now where's your quality control, right? So like every now and then that these like famous gaffes of like, oh, like this road sign in Welsh actually says like, I am out of the office, because like the translation service like just returned the voicemail auto response, and then the people who ordered the translation thought that was the answer and just wrote it out on the road sign, right? So like, how do you prevent those kinds of issues? Because they are like, you could see this thing where like, you're trying to use the technology to solve a problem, which is improve accessibility, but you end up making things worse because it's just completely garbage as a result, and you don't speak that language, so you can't validate it. And so there are all these kinds of questions of like, how do you validate this thing? that need to come into play if you're thinking of a technical solution around these kinds of needs.
Well, and this goes, I think, Joni, to your point as well, around what extraordinary opportunity New York offers as New
Yeah.
York. Because this question of red teaming, for example, right, of auditing AI systems and having different communities do it, the number of different communities, the number of different languages, the number of different sort of demographic groups that are represented in such a small geographic area. Like when you think of the supply of experts who can actually help run red teaming that is sort of community centric and that have the technical expertise for that, the idea that you can access that many different types of communities and that many different types of people relatively quickly is very unique. There's only a few cities in
Right.
the world
I mean, you
truly where
think
you could
about,
do that. It's
like,
incredible.
You know, you think about our city hospital system, which is 11 city hospitals that serves hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people every day, or at least every year. And there's like over 100 languages spoken in our city, and people can come into a New York City hospital and get care and seek care and speak to someone who's assisting them in translating whatever language they speak. It's pretty incredible, and I have to think New York City is one of the only places you can do that, and especially the number of different languages that are spoken and that we provide that type of care for. And that's just one example, the city hospitals, but it really is incredible. And I like at Oath, for example, I didn't say this, but we also have interpreters for anyone who needs it, and we're constantly, calling on the interpreters. I mean, every agency is required to, have translators and interpreters available, and for every service, there's translations, and every document that's issued by the city. Anytime something's put up on a website, every single page, it has to have the translation in those 11. I think it's 11 languages. Is it 11 or 10?
It's 10 excluding English.
10 exclude. Okay, so
Yeah.
it knows 10 languages. So it's just, millions of documents that have to get translated.
Olivia, is there a
pretty
question
incredible.
online?
We will take our next question from Owen Lee.
Hey, Owen.
Oh, and if you can speak into the microphone or unmute yourself. We seem to be having technical difficulties, so I'll just turn it back to you, Kat.
Okay. Oh, and you can just email me, man. Any other questions in the audience? Yes.
My name is Rachel Shaffrin. I was one of the people who raised my hand when you asked who has absolutely no relation to AI in their job. So forgive me if this is an obvious question. It seems like from this discussion, it's really clear that the use of AI comes with a lot of sort of collateral risk because AI doesn't understand what collateral damage is in the way that people do, and therefore needs oversight in the same way that a human employee does. And that feels like it's leading to a really fundamental shift in the way that like cities using AI staff things. And so I'm wondering like how you see, or if there is a plan in place to sort of make those shifts, because obviously AI reduces the need for certain humans in some places, but also demands like a lot of capacity building in other areas.
All right, labor lawyer, flex it.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like there's going to be a whole new civil service test for people who are going to be overseeing our AI overlords, right? I mean, there's going to have to be. And it's something that I think my generation has never thought about, doesn't have to think about, right? But for a younger generation, these are key like roles that, and I don't know how many people we're talking about who will fill those roles, but it's definitely going to be an important role given, as you said, and I think you made a great point about the risks and the unknowns that we just don't have at our fingertips.
And Jahal, one of the questions for me, especially when we think about like cities and governments, right, is always where does it make the most sense to create sort of new mechanisms or really focus on bringing in like scientific or technological expertise versus how much more powerful would it be to take the people who really know the system, the government, like the way that things work, and invest in skilling them up in like some of the fundamentals. For you, what are the sort of costs and benefits of those different approaches?
So part of the AI governance question, oftentimes it points to a more systemic issue around the fact that you don't have governance for this particular process. And so, for example, if you were just blindly trusting the output of your translators and not checking that it just says this is out of office, and then something bad happens because like you've just wasted public resources to put up a road sign that is just nonsense. So and imagine like now I'm trying to use AI for translation services. Like, do we have a process in place for verifying the validity, the accuracy, the correctness, the acceptability of what is being produced? And just as we are using AI to try to automate and scale and do more with less, can we also do the same thing with governance, right? So the need for governance and checking the answer grows with the number of answers that come out. And so if the output scales, then you need to have something that tries to keep up with that. And oftentimes this is the catch-up problem where like maybe AI would just generate a lot more work because now you need those people, maybe they're not, you're automating away call center agents, but then now you need people to make sure that ChatGPT is not saying like wrong things about your products or your city services to the people calling. And you know, just to bring up something that happened 2 weeks ago, I don't know how many of you saw this case in Canada about liability for Air Canada's chatbot. Okay, some people are familiar with it. So Air Canada was found liable for honoring the refund policy that the chatbot made up. And Air Canada's argument was to try to argue that the chatbot was a separate legal entity. I'm not a lawyer, but like this sounds wild to me.
Yeah.
So like until the day we can figure out how to sue AI and like make AI pay tax, like we're going to be babysitting this thing for a while.
Where and when and how you sue with AI is a fascinating question, by the way, and a deeply American one. We're basically at time. I want to be respectful of the folks who are joining us online. I know we're going to have a reception. Can you guys hang out and have a little snack? And so I want to end, because this is the young policy professionals group. I want to end with a quick question, kind of like 4 sentences, no more than that. What do you know now, based on the years that you've been working in your respective fields? What do you know now to be true that you wish you could go back and convince, say, your 27-year-old self, this is true? Like is there a thing that you would go back and tell yourself at 27 that like you know now that you wish you had known then?
Does it have to be within the scope of
Not
this
at
discussion?
all. Not at all. What do you think, Jahal? What about you?
4 things. Okay, so it's okay to switch careers. I've now switched careers like 3 or 4 times, and I do work that literally did not exist when I was in grad school, and that's fine. We should normalize that. That's the first thing. Second thing is sometimes opportunities just knock on your door and you don't even recognize them as opportunities. So like when I left academia to go work at a bank, and I'm like, why would I work at a bank? And then they were like, oh, we're gonna do data science on call center data. And I'm like, I have no idea why you're even talking to me. Like, what could possibly be interesting about this? And then I started doing the work, and I was like, wow, okay, so now we're worrying about comparing the call center experience in English and Spanish, because Capital One offers services in those 2 languages, and the regulators are interested to know, like, if you are getting more complaints from Spanish-speaking customers than English-speaking customers. How do you know that? And do you know why they're upset? Like, are they upset because the agent went off script? Is it because or was it something else? Just like new problems come your way, and sometimes you are that person to solve that problem because of the weird and wonderful like life trajectory that brought you to that place. Sorry, I started rambling. So
No, I
Yeah,
love that.
no,
I
and
love
that
that.
pretty much covered everything I have too, because my career has also kind of gone in a strange trajectory, and I was fortunate to have Bill de Blasio come and ask me to join his administration, and sort of set me off on a different path. And I was doing things that I had I came to city government and got thrown into this world of city politics with the city council and the budget and had no background in this. And one thing, it's important to know that like you're much more capable than you realize. And with, you know, you're college educated, there's so many things you can do and that you're capable of doing, and you kind of figure it out. And yeah, ask questions and you'll figure it out. So never be afraid to try new things.
And I feel like for me, you know, I was growing up like a white, cisgender, like, you know, middle to upper middle class, like Ivy League educated woman, like coming from Kentucky. So like systems worked pretty well for me, right? Like systems were more or less like, because we've dramatically failed at intersectional feminism, like systems generally worked for me. And so if I could go back now, knowing what I know, I would tell 20s me, have a lot less trust and faith in systems and give individuals a lot more grace. Be far more skeptical of systems and be far more open to individuals and listening to them. And I think that's in part because the only way that you break or build or improve a system that is not working for people is with people and through people. And I think that in the discussions today, like one of the reasons I was so excited for you all to meet Joni and Jahao is that that's exactly how they think about these questions of digital transformation as well. That it's not fundamentally about the technology. It's about the people that it's trying to serve and how you work with those people and bring them together. And all of you, as you move forward, will lean on each other to do exactly that as well. It's why I'm so grateful for this room. I'm so grateful to hope to get to meet all of you at the reception. And it's why I'm so grateful to CFR for bringing us together. And so with that, please thank Joni and Jahao and Tank.
Yes, you did so good. You were such a